In 1893, in the small Bavarian town of Kulmbach, a 12-year-old boy stood at his second parent's funeral in under a year. His mother had died the year before. Now his father was gone too. He had a small inheritance waiting for him, modest but real, and he had no idea yet that even that would eventually be taken from him. He had no family business to inherit, no famous name, and no reason whatsoever to assume that his own name would, within his lifetime, be engraved on more wrists than almost any other on earth. This is the story of Hans Wilsdorf, an orphan German boy who built Rolex, a company so unusual in its ownership structure that, to this day, it does not have a single shareholder in the way virtually every other major corporation on the planet does. Stick around, because the ending of the story is stranger than the watch ads let on. If you ever looked at a Rolex in a shop window and assumed it was built by some old aristocratic Swiss dynasty with 3 centuries of family silver behind it, subscribe now, because the truth is a German orphan, some very aggressive marketing instincts, and a name he came up with on the top deck of a London bus. Hans Wilsdorf was born on March 22, 1881, in Kulmbach, a town better known today for beer than watches. His family ran a moderately successful hardware and tool business, the kind of solid, unglamorous trade that quietly funds a comfortable middle-class childhood without anyone expecting the children to do anything particularly remarkable with their lives. That comfortable assumption ended fast. Hans's mother died in 1892. His father died the following year. By the age of 12, Hans Wilsdorf was an orphan, in an era with considerably fewer safety nets for orphan children than exist today, and considerably more opportunity for relatives to helpfully mismanage a dead man's estate. His uncles took charge, sold off the family business, and used some of the proceeds to send Hans and his siblings to a well-regarded boarding school in Bavaria called Ernestinum. Wilsdorf later described this period of his life in fairly blunt terms, admitting he initially hated the school and sank into what he described as a kind of depression, which is an understandable reaction for a 12-year-old who has just lost both parents and been shipped off to an institution by relatives handling his money with, let's say, varying degrees of diligence. Some accounts of his life claim that money meant for his inheritance was later lost or effectively stolen during his subsequent travels, meaning the boy who would go on to found one of the wealthiest private companies in the world spent his own adolescence with essentially nothing to fall back on. If there is an early lesson in the Wilsdorf story, it is that losing everything by age 12 does not necessarily doom a person to a small life. Sometimes it just removes a safety net that would have talked him out of taking a very strange bet later on. Wilsdorf eventually pulled himself together academically, and it turned out he had a genuine talent for 2 subjects that would matter enormously later, languages and mathematics. By his teenage years, he was fluent, or close to it, in German, French, and English, a skill set considerably rarer and more valuable in the 1890s than a search engine and an app can make it look today. This linguistic flexibility would end up being just as important to his future company as any watch mechanism he ever touched, since a business trying to sell precision instruments across national borders in early 20th century Europe needed someone who could correspond fluently with a Swiss manufacturer, an English retailer, and a French customer without a translator standing awkwardly in the room. At 19 or so, Wilsdorf left Germany and took a job with a company called Kuno Korten, based in La Chaux-de-Fonds, a Swiss town so thoroughly built around the watch trade that even its street layout was reportedly designed with watchmaking workshops in mind. Wilsdorf's job, though, was not glamorous. He spent his days winding, testing, and checking the accuracy of enormous quantities of pocket watches, one after another, for hours at a time, essentially becoming intimately, repetitively familiar with exactly how often and exactly how badly early mechanical watches failed to keep good time. It is the kind of job that either bores a person into a different career entirely, or teaches them precisely where an entire industry's weaknesses are hiding. For Wilsdorf, it turned out to be the second one. In 1903, Wilsdorf moved to London, and 2 years later, in 1905, he partnered with a man named Alfred Davis, whose sister Florence he would later marry, to found a company called Wilsdorf and Davis. Their business model at the outset sounds almost quaint by modern standards. They imported precision watch movements from Switzerland and fitted them into cases made in England, selling the finished watches to retailers who would then stamp their own name on the dial. This was, at the time, a completely normal way to run a small watch business. What was not normal was Wilsdorf's growing conviction that the entire industry was betting on the wrong product. In the early 1900s, pocket watches were the default, dignified choice for any respectable man, while wristwatches were widely regarded as a delicate, feminine accessory, more jewelry than instrument, and largely dismissed by serious watchmakers as too small to ever be built with real precision. Wilsdorf disagreed loudly and, as it turned out, correctly. He became convinced that wristwatches were the future, not a fashionable detour, and he committed the young company's limited resources toward proving that a wristwatch could be just as accurate as anything carried in a pocket. Most of the established watch industry at the time considered this roughly as sound a business strategy as building a company around the idea that hats were about to go out of style. Wilsdorf built his company on it anyway, and the rest of the 20th century would spend considerable effort proving him right. By 1908, Wilsdorf and Davis needed a brand name that could work internationally, was short enough to fit elegantly on a small watch dial, and crucially, was easy to pronounce correctly in multiple languages, since a brand name that came out garbled in French or Spanish was a real commercial liability at the time. According to Wilsdorf's own later account, he experimented with an enormous number of letter combinations, searching for something with the right rhythm, before the word simply arrived in one morning while he was riding on the upper deck of a horse-drawn omnibus through London. The name was Rolex. Nobody has ever definitively confirmed exactly what, if anything, it was meant to stand for, though Wilsdorf himself suggested it may have echoed the French phrase horlogerie exquisite, meaning exquisite watchmaking. What is certain is that it was short enough to fit cleanly on a dial alongside a small logo, easy to say the same way in German, French, and English, and completely made up, which meant nobody else could claim any prior ownership of it. In 1908, the Rolex trademark was formally registered. A century later, that word invented on the top deck of a London bus would end up being worth, by some brand valuations, in the neighborhood of $8 billion, which is a genuinely absurd return on a single omnibus ride. For its first decade, Rolex operated out of London, importing Swiss movements and assembling watches for the British market. Then the First World War broke out, and the British government, understandably preoccupied with funding an enormous war effort, imposed steep import taxes on luxury goods, including precisely the kind of imported Swiss watch movements and cases that Wilsdorf's entire business model depended on. What had been a reasonably efficient supply chain suddenly became an expensive one, taxed heavily every time a component crossed the English Channel in either direction. Wilsdorf, never a man to fight a tax code head-on, when he could simply relocate away from it, moved the company's operations to Geneva and Bienne in Switzerland by 1919, positioning Rolex directly at the source of the watchmaking expertise it had always depended on, and conveniently outside the reach of the British exchequer. It is, in effect, the story of one of the most famous Swiss watch brands in the world originally being a London company that only became Swiss because of a wartime tax bill. A detail that tends to surprise people who assume the brand's Swiss identity is centuries deep rather than a fairly practical business decision made in the middle of a global conflict. Early wristwatches shared a persistent, embarrassing flaw. They were not remotely waterproof, and worse, they were not even reliably dustproof, meaning a fine grain of sand at the beach or a light rain shower could ruin the delicate movement inside. For a product Wilsdorf was trying to convince the public was a serious, rugged instrument rather than delicate jewelry, this was close to fatal. In 1926, Rolex patented a case design called the Oyster, featuring a screw-down case back, bezel, and crown that sealed the movement inside as tightly as, well, an oyster shell seals a pearl. It was the first wristwatch case designed from the ground up to be genuinely waterproof and dustproof, and Wilsdorf, having solved an engineering problem, immediately turned his attention to the much harder problem of convincing the public to believe it. In October 1927, a young British swimmer named Mercedes Gleitze attempted to become the first woman to swim across the English Channel. Wilsdorf arranged for her to wear a Rolex Oyster on a cord around her neck throughout the roughly 10-hour swim through cold, salt, and near-constant water exposure. When Gleitze completed the crossing, the watch was reportedly examined and found to be in perfect working order, having survived hours of continuous immersion in conditions that would have destroyed virtually any other wristwatch on the market at the time. Wilsdorf immediately took out a full-page advertisement in London's Daily Mail, publicizing the watch's survival in vivid detail, in what is now widely regarded as one of the earliest and most effective pieces of modern product endorsement advertising in commercial history. A watch had survived a Channel swim. More importantly, a marketing strategy had just been born that Rolex would repeat in various forms for the rest of the century. Strap the watch to someone doing something extraordinary and dangerous, and let the resulting drama do the selling for you. Wilsdorf reportedly summarized his entire business philosophy in a single blunt sentence: that only great marketing was needed to make a company successful. He may have understated it slightly, but not by much. In 1931, Rolex introduced another engineering leap that would define the brand's technical identity for the rest of the century: a self-winding mechanism using a semicircular rotor that swung freely with the natural motion of the wearer's wrist, continuously winding the mainspring without the owner ever needing to manually wind the watch each morning. This system, marketed under the name Perpetual, eliminated one of the last remaining daily inconveniences, separating a mechanical wristwatch from simply forgetting the time entirely because you'd left your watch unwound on the nightstand. Between the Oyster's waterproofing and the perpetual self-winding motion, Rolex had, within a 5-year span, solved two of the most fundamental practical objections that had kept serious buyers loyal to old-fashioned pocket watches in the first place. The industry that had once considered wristwatches an amusing feminine trinket now had, sitting in front of it, a case it couldn't easily argue with. Having discovered with Mercedes Gleitze that attaching a Rolex to a documented feat of human endurance was extraordinarily effective advertising, Wilsdorf and later, the company Bill spent the following decades doing it again and again, deliberately. Rolex watches accompanied aviators on record-setting flights and mountaineers on brutal high-altitude expeditions. Culminating in 1953, when Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay wore Rolex watches during the first confirmed ascent of Mount Everest, an event the company celebrated shortly afterward by releasing a model named, with admirable lack of subtlety, the Explorer. That same decade brought the Submariner, a dive watch rated for serious depth, and the GMT Master, developed at the request of Pan American Airways, so that pilots could track 2 time zones simultaneously on transatlantic flights, since apparently regular jet lag wasn't punishing enough without a watch that couldn't keep up either. Each of these watches solved a real, specific professional problem for a real, specific extreme profession, and each one then quietly became a status symbol for people whose most demanding daily activity was a business lunch, which is either an ironic footnote or the entire secret of luxury marketing, depending on how cynical you're feeling. In January 1960, a specially built experimental Rolex watch called the Deep Sea Special was attached to the outside of the bathyscaphe Trias as it descended nearly 11,000 meters to the floor of the Mariana Trench, the deepest known point in the entire ocean, a place where the water pressure is roughly equivalent to having several elephants standing on a single postage stamp. The watch survived the descent intact and kept working, an engineering feat that generated exactly the kind of dramatic, headline-friendly proof point Wilsdorf had been engineering his entire career toward. He would not live to see the anniversary. Hans Wilsdorf died just 6 months later, on July 6, 1960, at his home on Lake Geneva, at the age of 79, having spent the final year of his life watching his company's watches survive both the deepest trench and highest mountain that planet Earth had to offer, which is a genuinely remarkable professional victory lap for an orphan who, 6 decades earlier, had lost both of his parents and most of his inheritance by the age of 12. Here's the detail that makes Rolex genuinely unlike almost any other major company on Earth. Wilsdorf's wife, Florence, died in 1944, and with no children of his own to inherit the business, Wilsdorf made an unusual decision. Rather than sell the company, pass it to relatives, or take it public on a stock exchange the way virtually every other major luxury brand eventually does, he transferred his shares into a private charitable trust called the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. That foundation, not a family, not a board of outside shareholders, not a public stock ticker, still owns Rolex today. There is no Wilsdorf heir cashing dividend checks. There is no annual shareholder meeting demanding quarterly growth targets. Rolex, uniquely among companies of its size and fame, answers to a charitable foundation whose profits fund causes in Geneva and to essentially no one else, which is also why Rolex, unlike almost every other major watch brand, does not publish detailed public earnings reports, does not answer to outside investors, and can make decisions on a multi-decade timeline that would make a normal quarterly earnings-obsessed corporation break out in a cold sweat. An orphan 12-year-old, who by his own account lost his inheritance somewhere along the way, ended up building a company that, by design, cannot be inherited by anyone at all. It simply exists, quietly funding a Swiss city's charities, forever, run by executives answering to a foundation established by a man who once had nothing to answer to but a boarding school he hated and an industry that thought his best idea was a joke. If you enjoyed watching an orphan turn a bus ride and a stubborn opinion about wristwatches into an $8 billion brand with no actual owner, you'll probably enjoy the next one too. Subscribe, and tell us in the comments which brand's origin story you want to see next.